to moderate to approach these two important dimensions that are being negotiated in the process of funding for development, that this year has one of the most important moments, um, say sort of as a moment of coordination in Sevilla, um, for which civil society is getting prepared and the negotiations are happening. We are undergoing the process of negotiation between the countries where they're discussing the final text that is going to be agreed upon in Seville. And for that, we are arranging a series of webinars, and one of them is w- where we want to approach two important subjects, one of them having to do with climate and related aspects, um, biodiversity and so on, and also the dimension of gender. So this webinar is co-organized by LatinDat and the civil society mechanisms that's approaching funding for development, and specifically the task forces working groups that are part of this mechanism. The working group that has to do with climate funding, ecologic funding, and the work group about gender. My name is Rodolfo Bejarano. I work in the area of financing in LatinDat, financing architecture in LatinDat, and we are going to have two specialists and activists in this subjects. We have Carola Mejia from LatinDat and also April Porteria from APWT, who are also part of the working groups and coordination that have been working in this subject matters within the mechanisms, and also assistants and participants in different occasions in the negotiation processes, both in New York and in other moments that have been happening in these preparations that have been happening for a while now. Let's remember that we have translation, we have interpretation, English to Spanish and Spanish to English, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box or the chat. So we're going to start with the dimension of climate. We have Carola Mejia. She's a Bolivian economist. She is licensed in the Católica University of Sao Paulo. She has a master's in economic development with a specialty in sustainable development and environment in the Netherlands. She has years of experience as a consultant in public-private organizations and international cooperations related to climate change, sustainable development, financing, and climate justice. And she's the coordinator of climate justice, transition, and Amazon in LatinDat, and consultant in the Vida Foundation. So, Carola, we're gonna let you have the mic uh, for 15 minutes, and then we're gonna go to April. Thank you. Thank you, Rodo. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. For those who need interpretation, I'm gonna do this presentation in Spanish, but we do have the um, translation in English. So you can go ahead and activate that in the menu. So thank you so much for joining us. These are very important matters, as Rodolfo was saying. We are very close to the fourth conference of funding for development. And for us, it is a great opportunity to promote systemic reforms, these transformations that we need in the economic and financing systems and trading systems to attend the multiple crises that we're facing. So today, not only am I going to talk about the climate crisis, but we actually have several environmental crises that are being caused by human activity, by the current economic systems, the capitalism, extractivism, mood that is high consumption, and the dependence that we have, the high dependence that we have in burning fossil fuels, the um, exploitation of nature for the enrichment of a few. So I think the systems are the ones that are leading us to this point of no return that we always mention those who work in environment. There are planet limits. There are nine planet limits that we are exceeding. One of them has to do with climate change. But we have the other ones, such as the use of drinking water, the changes in use of the land, the acidification of the oceans, the ozone in the atmosphere, the aerosol load. There's a lot of things that are being exacerbated because these human activities, this forever search of economic growth based on the exploitation of natural resources is leading us to this, and which is why in August each year around there, we exceed the natural budget of the planet to regenerate itself. So we are exceeding the regeneration capacity of the planet. And when we're talking about climate change, we are already entering a very dangerous threshold. The science recommended not to exceed the increase in temperatures. Um, in comparison to industrial times in 1.5 degrees, and we already did. Scientists said in the framework of the Paris Convention to reduce 43% of emissions of these polluting gases that generate climate change up to 2030, and the emissions are still increasing. In the negotiations regarding climate change, we don't see any political will to undergo real changes to reduce emissions. What we see is false solutions based on the market, the carbon markets, the very expensive technologies to absorb carbon, and things that don't really solve the issue and that are actually putting at risk the life of many people. The climate change and climate crisis are and biodiversity crisis are exposing people more and more to this occurrence of extreme climate events such as intense rains that are becoming worse, generating floodings and damaging infrastructure to people, to production. Droughts are becoming longer, and that affects the production of food. We are also experimenting fires that are becoming harder to control because the heat is becoming more intense. Therefore, the drought and the heat are making these fires advance rapidly, and they're very hard to control. In my country, we have lost 12 million hectares just last year of forests, and obviously a lot of biodiversity. We are also experimenting many other changes, more progressive changes. For example, in Bolivia, my country, we have already lost 50% of the Andes glaciers, which are the main source of drinking water for rural communities and also for the cities. So the water issue, the availability of water is key. It's a very important issue. So when we say, why do we have to talk about these environmental issues in the framework of funding for development and these negotiations in the framework of the UN? It is very important for two main reasons. One is what I have already been explaining, the economic and financial systems that are current, that are valid, the commercial trading systems that have destined the global south to be an exporter of raw materials, and we have been put in that situation, make it so that the climate crisis and other environmental crises are becoming deeper and they're not receiving assistance. When I was reading documents of the FFD and the recommendations of the United Nations to the countries, to promote a development, the first thing they do is to recommend an economical growth. And the economical growth understood in these terms of um, GDP and gross income, and where we have to use this increase and this peak under any ghost, that's what's pushing the planet to a no return point. That is what's generating so many environmental issues and putting at risk the life of many people, of many species that are also being lost due to these changes that are happening in the climate, the crisis of biodiversity that is not being tended for, the acidification of the oceans. All of these nine limits or boundaries that the planet has that we are already exceeding, we are making them go way faster. And we're since if we're looking for the growth in the way that we've been doing so for the last year, so we need to change that pattern of development, understanding that the development in terms of that economical growth, that is not development. That has not solved the structural uh, problems, particularly in the global south, in countries that are still experimenting lots of issues related to poverty, inequality. Latin America is one of the more unequal um, areas in the world. We have many issues that have not been resolved. We're still under an exporter of raw material system, an extractivist system. We're still dependent on this, and obviously this puts us at risk. It generates lots of conflicts with the communities, and in many times are displaced, are killed because they resist to the vulneration of their rights. To having multinational companies come to exploit the resources in their territories, and there's governments that actually promote that kind of practices. And if the United Nations says, okay, we need to grow. That is the solution. The growth understood in those terms is going to lead us to destruction. So therefore, it is important, say, as one of the causalities, to think obviously in these environmental issues, all of the consequences that these decisions related to financial subjects are going to have on environment and on climate crisis. But on the other hand, we cannot think about development without taking in consideration the the what this climate crisis involves in the economy of the countries. This is generating many losses, many financial and non-financial damages. It's generating millions of dollars of damages every year due to these occurrences that are going to become worse. These extreme climate events, this advancement of the increasing of temperature in the planet, in the oceans, the loss of glaciers, those are irreversible, and those generating issues that's generating migration that is exacerbating social vulnerabilities of people, and particularly it's something that is also related to climate justice. So who suffer the most of these impacts are the countries that are the least responsible for these environmental crises, which are the countries in the global south. And actually the ones in the north that has contributed and contribute the most to those emissions, to those contaminant um, or pollutant gases are the ones that are not wanting to implement real solutions. Those are the ones blocking the negotiations. Those are the ones that have just started talking about fossil fuels about 2 years ago in the conversations about climate change, when this is actually a key matter that we need to attack and we need to stop promoting. We need to change, obviously, the kind of energy that we have and that we depend on, but we also need to reduce the consumption of that energy. And that is another thing. We cannot understand the development without taking in consideration these repercussions, these environmental issues. We need to take in consideration the development from this more comprehensive perspective, um, from the well-being of the population of the planet and living in harmony with its natural limits, of being able to develop ourselves looking for that well-being, a collective well-being, and not just the accumulation of wealth in very few hands. So that is key. That is something that we cannot stop analyzing. And it was actually last year that in the framework of the civil society mechanism of FFD, funding for development, Latinidad, Equidad, and other organizations that work in these climate issues, environmental issues, both including a work group about these matters, so that we strengthen that cross-sectionality of these issues, climate gender, in the negotiations of funding for development. As I mentioned, the negotiations that have to do with climate change, biodiversity, desertification are not enough. And in these negotiations, we're always told we cannot um, attend to things that have to do with taxes, because that's not our jurisdiction. So where can we negotiate these things? So FFD, when we talk about the vicious circle of debt and the climate crisis and extractivism that Latin that and other organizations more than that and others are analyzing, when we try to show that the highly vulnerable countries to climate change are also highly in debt, and that the funding that is reaching these countries is generating more debt, that climate funding that should help is actually exacerbating the levels of debtness. People in these negotiations, in climate change negotiations, they say, okay, we cannot discuss that here. Those are financial things. Those cannot be negotiated here. That is completely out of the scope of negotiations of the convention. So where can we negotiate that? In the FFD. So when we talk about trade, when we talk about this unfair exchange of goods, of natural resources, and now also talking in the framework of this transition that needs to happen, this energy transition towards renewable energies, there's a big pressure in our countries, in the global south, to continue to exploit certain critical minerals, certain timber, to create these aeolic towers, lithium, minerals such as lithium, like Chile and my own country have in their territories, and that becomes very controversial because, okay, we need to transition to renewable economies, but what is the cost to the global south? And we gonna go deeper in its activism. Yesterday, I was working in these workshops with the indigenous communities in the south of Potosi, and Potosi is a region where we have these lithium reserves that they're looking to exploit and are actually exploited already, and they are looking to open those to the multinational companies, to foreign investment in Bolivia. And those communities were saying, we do not want to have happen what happens with mining, for them to take the water, to leave us without water because they want to exploit the lithium in these territories, to have our territories be polluted by this extraction. So those are things that we need to analyze when we talk about that transition. So therefore, it's very important to talk and to strengthen these matters in a very cross-sectional way in the negotiations regarding funding for development, as we do, and as we have these as we advocate in other spaces that are specialized in these issues, as in the UN Convention for Climate Change and for Biodiversity, and other conventions that are current and where these issues are negotiated. Now, when we created the group last year, we started to develop a little bit the storytelling. What do we want to promote? And we don't want to limit ourselves to just talking about funding to assess the climate change crisis and the loss of biodiversity, and other environmental crises. We do not want to limit ourselves to that. We actually want to talk about these repercussions, to this dual causality or dual causations, how the financial, economical, and trading systems are making this environmental crisis more deep. And this crisis is how they create these vulnerabilities in the population, particularly in the global south. So these are very important discussions, relevant discussions. And there's something else. In the framework of funding for development, there is a group, or there is a working line regarding international cooperation. So the funding for climate should be additional to the international cooperation, but sadly, it's being counted twice, and that is an issue that we need to make more visible. That cooperation, just like the climate funding, under the circumstance and the international context we're in right now, is being reduced. It wasn't enough already. They had committed $100 billion annually from the countries that are more responsible from the climate change. That commitment was made on 2019. It has not been met for a while. And last year, we were going to establish a new goal, and the commitment was tripled. But we knew that the needs was like $1 trillion at that point, not just the billion that was offered before in the agreement regarding the new goal. And then quality of the financing, which is what Latindat and other allies are working on, and trying to show that the way in which the resources have been channeled to the countries that are more affected by climate change is not being done properly, because mainly two-thirds of that funding are loans, not necessarily under good conditions. The multilateral banks have a role there of channeling funding and non-concessional funding, such as loans for climate change, which we criticize a lot. Give me 1 second, I just want to connect my battery. And on the other hand, these are fundings that are arriving in a very inefficient way. The international funds, climate funds, such as the Green Climate Fund, take like 5 years in approving a project, right? When the emergency is happening right now, when we need those funds right now, there are not many direct access windows. They're funding mitigation projects and not adaptation, which is urgent in the global south. There's a new fund for losses and damages that has been approved, but there's a lot of controversies involved. It's being managed by the World Bank, which is a bank that also is very criticized. And on the other hand, they're promoting the same instruments, the same mechanisms, loans, right? For people that has lost everything due to climate change, who are going to be receiving those fundings? They're discussing many, many things, and that is why it's important to combine this matter in both spaces. Just like the taxing matter, taxes, those are being discussed in the convention. They say it's not the right space. Now there's a framework, a convention about taxes in the UN, on which we have to work. We have to advocate for the climate matter to be attended for so that they actually charge taxes to these great pollutants. They're not just the countries in the north, but also the great corporations of fuel for um, fossil fuels, for example, that are making a lot of money by damaging the country, just to mention some of the things. And so it is very important that we're present, that we understand the opportunity. This fourth convention represents for us a great opportunity to promote changes that are systemic, reforms that are systemic. These changes in the economical system, in this financial system that is also making us more in debt. The debt is that neo-colonial instrument that is continuing to put their hands in our neck to our southern countries because we're still in debt with the north, and we have to continue in that path of extractivism to ensure the payment of that debt that is never paid in the end. And that we're also depending on this funding, receiving funding for climate in the way of loans. And also something else that I wanted to mention just to wrap this up is the private funding. The role that is given to private funding in the framework of these negotiations of the FfD and in the negotiations of climate change and of the biodiversity convention is very big. They're always saying, since there's no public resources or enough of them, the private sector is going to be the one solving the issues. So far, they have not been able to close that gap to 10 for the 2030 agenda. They're not going to be able to close a gap in needs of climate change or environmental crises because the private sector is not interested in making these investments, for example, for adaptation, for damages and losses if they don't receive some kind of earning. And it's also just a way to have these great countries to wash their hands, to dilute their responsibilities. So under these innovative mechanisms that they're always promoting with saying that they want to reduce the risk in private investment, like the multilateral banks are doing for development, or you know, providing benefits and everything. And the other more market-wise alternatives, such as carbon markets, and these other instruments, such as the debt exchanges that are they're trying to use as a solution. These are not solving the climate crisis in a structural way from the cause, the root cause of these issues. They're not solving that. It's just a band-aid for a patient that has cancer that needs a different treatment. So we think that in the framework of this convention for funding for development, we can actually promote the systemic changes in the financial, economical, trading, commercial, taxing systems that are going to allow to tend for the climate, environmental crises that we're generating, and on the other hand, to understand the what these crises involve, what the impact is on the life of people. So we invite you to join us if you're not in the social society mechanism, the FFD, which is the main um, part to advocate in that space. And if you are, you can become part of these groups. We lead this group, the climate group, alongside Equidad for Mexico. So you're invited to join us in this fight that we have and that we need to promote this year. That is going to be very important. Thank you. Thank you, Carol. So you brought to the table very important issues that have to do with how this current system, the capitalist system, with neoliberal policies, and that are also predators and that accumulate the wealth and that concentrate the wealth in certain groups, that is part of all of those causes that have led us to these different crises that we have, amongst that climate crisis. But also these crises are affecting mainly certain groups, amongst them, for example, women. There are issues that are cross-sectional with everything that is being negotiated in the FFD. Carol already mentioned it. even in that text that is being negotiated currently, there is a paragraph or a section that talks about climate funding. And we can say that that is a step forward, but there are positions from countries that are opposing, and the big power countries try to take some important matters that are initially in the text. They want to take them out that are proposed in this text that have to do with common and differentiated liabilities, differentiating what is discussed in the COP. But there are countries in development, particularly that mostly want to defend to have that say in the text. And also the same thing happens with gender conditions. There are positions in some countries that want to take out everything that has to do with gender, everything that has to do with the role of women, or say propose something that is more progressive in terms of the role of feminism in the economy and funding. And I think that this is also important to be taken into account because it is part of uh, this issue in the is the issue that the issues that we've had in the southern countries regarding the colonialism, the fact that they only want to extract resources, and that affects society in different aspects. So having said that, I am gonna introduce April. April is currently an officer in the justice program for feminist development in the Asia Pacific Forum, APULD, which is a leading network of over 300 feminist and activist networks in Asia Pacific. They work to promote human rights of women and justice for development. She has collaborated with groups, national and international groups in matters of economical justice, um, food security, environment, justice, and she has 14 years of experience in promoting the participation of leaders in the 2030 agenda. So I am going to let her have the mic. Thank you so much, April, for joining us. I know that over there uh, it's pretty late, so thank you for making the effort to be here. So we're going to let you have the room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo and colleagues. Yes, good evening. I am based in Manila, so it's the other part of the globe. But thank you so much, no, for the invitation. Yeah, actually, aside from being EPWLD, we are actually co-leading the newly established feminist work stream of the CSO FFD mechanism together with Latin Dad, no, and Femnet from our colleagues in Africa. And that's why my presentation for today is actually on the gender aspect and basically the gender agenda, the feminist agenda for FFD4. Yeah, so as maybe some of you have been seeing, no, the conversations, especially in the negotiations, as Rodolfo mentioned, we have been observing a watering down of language in terms of gender. So it's really, and of course, we have been seeing how the anti-gender, anti-rights, far-right governments are actually influencing, no, and really working hard in order to what do you call this, to reverse the different wins that the women's movement have won, no, in the past decade. So, I mean, if some of you have been engaging in the Committee on the Status of Women, for instance, no, we have seen a lot of this. So, FFD4 is not new. So, I mean, it's also a multilateral space, no, that is actually experiencing the same reverse of language and commitments in terms of gender. So yeah, I just want to start by actually looking at FFD4, no? of course, we have been asking for this. We have been waiting for this 10 years since Addis, but it's also happening in a very challenging time, no? As we see, global institutions at the moment are currently in crisis, and so is the state of multilateral governance. But at the same time, it is also an opportune time for civil society, social movements, and specifically the feminist movements to put forward critical recommendations. And I think, yeah, as Carola also pointed out, an opportunity, no, a critical moment to transform the international financial architecture. Now, I would like this. My examples are actually from the region, from Asia Pacific, no. But I hope, yeah, it's okay to share. Like a case in point, for instance, if we look in the state of the Sustainable Development Goals, no, because as we know, this is the follow up to Addis in terms of the achievement of the SDGs. Definitely, it's not going to be achieved in 2030. Like for instance, the data that we have in Asia is that this is from UN, no? The UNSCAP data is that the projection on the achievement of the goals is actually 2062, which is 32 years behind schedule. So this is really glaring and reflecting of what's wrong with the system basically. And this projection is just based on 53% of the data available. And I would like to highlight because one of the goals that have a very least available data to be able to measure is goal 5, which is gender equality. Another one is goal 16 on peace, justice, and the least available with the least available data and in the region. And I think this is also related to Carola's presentation. The major regressions is on goal 13, which is climate. No, so it's really happening globally, and even the data in terms of the SDGs, even though it's just 53%, it's really showing of the realities that we are facing. So women at the end, and then of course the climate suffering. And then, yeah, maybe just to add in terms of gender, of course, we have been seeing no increase in unpaid care work, increasing gender-based violence, especially coming from the pandemic, as well as informalization of work. So I think this is a very important point, no, when we talk about the women in the workforce, for instance. So like more women dropping from the workforce to perform care duties at home. So this is related to unpaid care work, and this trend is also related to the rising informalization of work. um yeah, now moving forward with FFD, no, because I think if you have seen how the negotiations and even how does the first draft look like, it's really looking at women or the solutions to gender equality, looking at women as a resource, no, it's actually when we look at, for instance, the concept of women economic empowerment. I think World Bank is really promoting this, and we from APWLD is very critical on this because we see this, no, as a way to actually see women as a commodity, no, to be able to be part of the workforce and to serve the current system. So with FFD, we think it's really an opportunity, no, to raise awareness on the role of women and also the changes and transformations that we want for a genuine gender equality. And then I think we also need to demystify, like for instance, the UN, of course, is framing FFD4 as a solution to address the financing gap, no, in order to quote unquote fast track the SDGs, which is really the problem, because for us it's this isn't the problem why the SDGs are not gonna be achieved, no, basically the non-achievement of the SDGs is just a system, no, of a failing symptom of a failing system, sorry. And thus we really demand, no, or we really we really look forward for FFD4 to look beyond the SDGs and to really prioritize the root causes of global inequalities. um Now I will we actually have the feminist work stream, no, of the mechanism is actually preparing a key ask that we are gonna bring to Sevilla. So if you will just let me run through this, and it actually covers the major issues under FFD. I think, yeah, when we observe the period between Monterrey and Addis, we actually note, no, a major regression in the global commitments to development finance. And yeah, I think Rodolfo and Carola also touch upon that already. And of course, this also entails affecting women's human rights, the lowering of public financing for social services, and etc. And the even UN data is showing this very, very clearly. So thus, it's really an opportunity, no? It's a critical time, it's a critical moment to put forward critical recommendations. So, for instance, of course, we are pushing for a fair, equitable tax system. So yeah, that's why we are really negotiating, no, and pushing a very strong UN framework convention on international tax cooperation. And in this space, we are actually demanding, no, for the decision making to be at the UN, no, instead at the hands of the G7 or G20, for instance. Another aspect, I think, on private financing, no, which I think Carola already mentioned, but I would like to also call your attention in terms of what the UN is using right now. So they have been using the term multi-stakeholderism, no. I think for civil society it's also very common, but it's how the UN uses it. It's actually inviting private sector in the development table. So I think if you have heard, even UNDESA is organizing a private sector hub. And if you have also heard, in FFD4, there's gonna be a parallel international business forum. So it's really selling, it's really about profit and selling the development agenda, no? And as we said, it's not gonna, it's for profit, no, it's not actually genuine. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of how this private finance modalities impact women. So for instance, of course, the reduction of I mean the reduction of public finance, for instance, in the schemes of public-private partnerships. Now they call it also blended finance, etc. And then on that, this is also very important, because we look at this as a very important fight for FFD4. Of course, we see how austerity measures have been impacting women and girls. And I think, yeah, for FFD4, we're really pushing, no, for the establishment of a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt. As again, this gives the decision making and the negotiations in the UN, no, and outside of the corporate control. Just a few last is on aid as well, on ODA. So if I think if you have heard as well of news from the past months, there is actually a trend of dwindling ODA, no, coming from the donor countries. But yeah, I think I would like to add on this that there is also a rise in terms of defense spending. So it's gonna be critical to raise these issues in FFD4. And of course, again, it's strengthening the UN, the multilateral governance in terms of the IDC governance. And then lastly, on trade, I think, yeah, this was also mentioned earlier, no, but I would like to yeah, call your attention on investor state dispute settlements for FFD4. And as we see in the negotiations, this is really an important aspect, as we see, as we demand our governments is to really have a multilateral agreement for the coordinated and permanent secession of ISDS, no, because we see this as a very unfair and very colonial extractive mechanism, no, that, yeah, that furthers unequal trade. Yeah, so these are just some of the recommendations of the feminist work stream. And we hope to share with you the full key ask as we go deeply into the negotiations. And of course, we're also gonna do similar educational spaces no towards Sevilla. And then maybe just last is also to call on strengthening the Global South coordination facilitation in Sevilla. As we know, it's in Spain. To be honest, most of us in Asia are having challenges in visa, but yeah, hopefully it's not gonna limit our physical participation, no, but also to connect with movements across regions to have a very strong global South presence and engagement in Sevilla. Thank you so much, and I hope I gave my talking points to the interpreter, so I hope it's helpful.
Thank you very much. You have commented on the most important issues that are being discussed right now in this context, where the negotiations are happening for this group. Also, the geopolitical context that we are undergoing right now in the world puts us in an urgent situation alongside the help that we receive for development, this policy of donors to not just not meet their commitments, historical commitments that they have never met of 0.07%, but now they even tend to reduce that assistance officially instead of prioritizing the cooperation. They are, for example, in Europe, they are prioritizing the expenditure in weapons, which is something that should be condemned. It shouldn't be allowed. And furthermore, we're undergoing a context where we're in the middle of the tariff war, the trade war that the US started, but also answered by important actors such as China. So that it is important to analyze how the FFD and the FFD places itself between that struggle that is going to be affecting our countries, in particular, developing countries, global South countries, beyond all of the historical issues that are structural that we suffer in terms of taxing and financing systems that are unfair, also the assistance in many territories is going just to benefit the donors. So we're still in the middle of this trade war and we are embedded in this world that is globalized, but we are in the lower part of the food chain because we are the suppliers of raw materials and everything that leads to everything that has to do with extractivism that exacerbate climate issues and our vulnerability facing disasters. But furthermore, we suffer from the fact that our governments need to prioritize certain expenditures. They have a debt, but and for that you have to not assign resources to important social sectors and public services. And they impose austerity measures and they open the doors to private investment that is less regulated and is being leveraged more by the governments with public resources so that they don't have any risk of loss of those investments. So we're in the middle of a whole mesh that comes from historical structural issues, but that also currently are being exacerbated due to all of these issues that we're seeing. And that is where we have the important role of this process of FFD, in which from civil society, we're looking for the structural and systemic changes that in a way may start to solve these issues that we have from the global south, but with the premise that the northern countries need to acknowledge also that historical debt that needs to be repaired urgently. So we wanted to remind you that this session is being recorded. We're going to be sharing the recording. And also in the chat box, somebody was asking if there's any data that might be shared. April has shared information of Asia Pacific regarding, well, the countries in that region, where she does her follow-up of the data of the SDGs. So maybe we can see a way in which we can share some of that things, of those things. And also in Latin America, we have had a forum of sustainable development recently organized by CEPAL, where we see that definitely we're not moving forward much in the SDGs. Some of them we're actually moving backwards, or we're not going to reach them, right? Very few of them are going to reach their goals, right? Those established goals towards 2030. We are 5 years from those targets. And if those changes and reforms don't happen that are being proposed from the financing, but also other issues, we are not going to be able to meet any of the goals. So there's a question. I think that we can go to Q&A, right? We do have one question from Rodolfo Mendoza. He says that the key actors, so some key actors are actually the indigenous peoples, and they go alongside what was mentioned with some groups that are affected directly, that are more affected than others, just as was mentioned with women. The indigenous peoples are as well. They also suffer that destruction. In other countries where the population, for example, that are African descendants, they also suffer the consequences of the policies, the neoliberal policies. And it is important to propose also the participation and the point of view of these populations from the work stream of climate and ecological funding of FFD, of the mechanism. We are proposing this participation to incorporate more and more the indigenous peoples, but I'm going to leave Carola maybe to answer that. And there's a comment here. Well, it's not a question, but in any case, maybe for April to go a little deeper on some deep details regarding how this policy of promotion of private investment, for example, affects mainly women. These negotiations are happening, a series of proposals that are not new, but they call them innovative mechanisms for funding that are basically to provide facilities to private investment. But in the end, this becomes in sort of a uh, uh, having everything that has to do with development, sustainable development, and climate change is subject to being negotiated, of being traded. So I think that we can take those two questions right now, and then we're going to continue to receive some other comments. So, Carol, can you start? Thank you, Rodolfo. I apologize for not opening the camera. Thank you for the question. Definitely, indigenous peoples need to be involved. They need their participation needs to be promoted in all spaces, and this one is particularly important. And as Rodolfo said, from the climate workstream, we are promoting that engagement so that the mechanism can have the voices of the indigenous people present. In our group, for example, if you've been in the prior webinar regarding this subject matter, we had a young activist leader from indigenous peoples in Peru, Carlos Lozano. He's actually going to travel to New York to be present in these meetings of FFD. And he has had also a very important discourse He talks about the relevance of indigenous peoples, not just in the care of the forest and the planet and their cosmovision, but also in the importance of uh, getting their ancestral knowledge back, how they can provide real solutions and alternatives to this climate crisis that we're living, and also how those that receive the worst impact of these crises and all of the pressure that exists in their territories from these multinational companies that are coming and exploiting under any cost. He was telling us, for example, that his family was a victim of murder, violence. They had to leave their territory because them themselves have experimented and still experiment this kind of pressure from this whole international economic system. So they were saying how they can leave us out of these negotiations as if this didn't affect us. This affects us directly. It affects our lives. These political decisions that are taken in these spaces actually affect us directly, and we do need to be present and to take our proposals, our realities, our testimony. So we are going to continue to promote that engagement, that participation in these mechanisms, in these other spaces in which we participate. So so that is not just the voices of the global south, but that we also have these groups that are highly vulnerable to these multiple crises that we're facing. And to answer something that Marta was asking, we want to invite you tomorrow to a workshop that we have for Latin American organizations. We're gonna be trying to see more strategically how to approach different subjects in the framework of the FFT. So that's another space where maybe we can participate more actively, so we invite you to participate. Rhoda is probably going to give more information in the end. Yes, thank you, Caro. And before going to that information, April, do you have the mic actually to just answer whatever you consider is relevant.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. Although some of the words are in Spanish, but yeah, I will just refer to the question on private finance, I guess. Uh, yeah, I think yeah, I talk about because I talk about the multi-stakeholderism, no, and if I think some 2 years ago there was a campaign with the well, it's the women major group and some feminist groups because UN Women is about to sign an agreement with BlackRock, which is a big investment company based in the US, no, but operating globally. And of course, we know that this has a lot of human rights violations in many communities. So this is just an example, no, of how I think the we think, no, the dwindling public financing, so it's also reflected in the UN, and the UN trying to uh find funds, and the corporations are there. That's one. And then I would like to give a very country specific, for instance, I'm trying to actually see our case studies, like for instance in the region. And of course, we keep saying, no, that public-private partnerships, for instance, has a lot of negative impacts in our communities, and we have a lot of evidence looking into that. That's why our call is really to have accountability mechanisms to review and scrutinize these partnerships. Anyway, so I think one of the very glaring is, for instance, the privatization of social services. No, of course, with the lack of resources, lack of financing, women are doing more care work at home, and also because of high costs like water, electricity, women need to go to informal work. So that's what I said earlier, no, there is a trend of a rising informalization of work, and then of course it's coupled with gender-based violence. So because informalization means we can attract them, no, and there's no labor, um basically there's no labor governance when one goes to informal work. And I think one concrete example as well is on the privatization of healthcare. So like there are many stories of how the lack of sexual reproductive health services, no, in many countries like Sri Lanka. So one of actually the like a post yeah, it's 2 years ago when the death crisis exploded. I think there are stories of women giving birth without anesthesia. So, I mean, we can look at it at the global, how privatization is happening, and, this private finance campaign of the UN is actually reflected, no, in many layers. So I think this stories from the ground is something that we need to bring to FFD4 in Sevilla. And I think especially because there's an international business forum happening parallel, which we heard is actually receiving a lot more interest from member states. So I think, yeah, as activists, as social movements, we really need to, put the realities there and oppose and expose these mechanisms. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Ah, So since there's no more questions, there are actually many comments in the chat. But we are considering all of the comments, of course, and I see that there is a lot of will to share experiences, to share knowledge from each of us in our own work organizations. This is also important to consider because we see that there's a lot of expectation regarding the participation of organizations that are not necessarily inserted in the FFD process, and they want to engage, and they want also to contribute towards the summit moment in Sevilla, the FFD4. So I think that it is important to propose a space to coordinate, to have many more articulations between organizations, not just within Latin America, but also in the global south with Asia, with Africa. And the mechanism of civil society with the FFD provides that opportunity. But also from Latin that we are proposing to have a workshop with civil society organizations to actually generate these articulations in Latin America. This workshop is going to be happening tomorrow at 10 a.m. Lima time. So we are actually sharing right now in the chat box information about that so that you can go into the link, you can register. That's 10 a.m. Lima, Peruvian time. So you are invited to participate and be part of this workshop that is happening in a moment where there's a series of meetings, not just the preparatory meetings towards the FFD4, but also the intersessionals, which are these more informal meetings in which they discuss specific points regarding the text that is being discussed and that is going to be presented or discussed, even though many people may say that they're thinking that the text should be ready in Sevilla. So we are undergoing that path. There's a lot of a journey to be walked yet. Not everything is ready, us, but but civil society has an important role, and for that we need to be articulated, and objectives need to be clear. The series of webinars that we're having are trying to do that, propose and exchange points of views, knowledge, but also where the proposals are headed. So we're going to continue down this path. We are going to share the recording. We're also going to share the links to other webinars. And we look forward to seeing you in the next activities that we're having. And those who cannot participate in Sevilla, of course, we need to see the way in which or we can have actions, or you can have actions from your own territories, your own countries within that framework to propose a voice, a strong voice from different dimensions and from the different points in the globe particularly the South. So having said that, I want to thank the interpretation. Thank you so much also for the participation of our panelists, and see you next time. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.